Hello, nerds. Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I am your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here today. We have author Nicholas Jubber, who has written the book The Fairy Tellers, which chronicles some of the fairy tellers from history, how they pulled together these deeply weird stories sometimes, and how we still remember them today, like Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen. Fantastic conversation. Nick was really interesting to talk to. He's done a lot of cool things, been a lot of cool places. So let me just shut up and let you hear what he has to say. Nicholas Jubber, let's talk to him. All right, welcome to the podcast, Nicholas Jubber. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Brendan.
All right, so Nick, first things first, we're going to talk about your book, The Fairy Tellers, which I absolutely loved. But one of your jobs is to be a travel writer. Like, you're traveling around, you're writing and stuff like that. I can't think of how many movies I've seen where people are like, I would love to just travel and write, and yet somehow you did it. Is there a special way that you came about this, or was it just luck of the draw?
I don't know if I always think of it as luck of the draw, given the money involved. It started out really as I was working when I'd left uni, working in a publishing company actually, and I seemed to spend my whole life with filing cabinets and doing Excel spreadsheets and making coffee for people. I mean, I was basically a temp, and I realized I didn't want to work in an office. So I got an opportunity to be a teacher in Jerusalem and traveled out there and taught in this fascinating school in the old city of Jerusalem. A lot of politics was going on, as it always is around there. A lot of fighting. The Intifada had broken out, and it was a fascinating time to be out there. But the school got closed down because of the fighting. Occasionally, it would reopen, and the students would come back on crutches, saying, "Oh, I fell down the stairs," and you know that they'd really been involved in some terrible battles, and so there was a lot to write about, and so I started writing articles, and that led to getting published by a few papers and magazines, and then traveling a bit more widely in the region into Syria and Lebanon and Egypt and so on. And that led to my first book, The Presta Quest. And I was lucky enough to get a publishing deal and to win a prize for that book. So that sort of has led on to some of the books that have followed.
I mean, you're talking about there's a lot going on in that area of the world generally most of the time. How many times did you think, you know what, I just got to go back to England? Like, this is a lot. Or is it something that you find it all so interesting being part of history that you just keep sticking it out?
Yeah, I get consumed by it, and I sort of forget that there's even a home to go back to, which is probably a bad thing. But I just get really fascinated by it. And like you say, history happening. I think that was one of the really abiding things for me about being in Jerusalem, was that sense of this is a place that's lived through so much history. But the time that I started out there, when the Second Intifada broke out, it felt like history was really happening right in front of your eyes. And why would you turn away from that? It's just such an interesting thing to see. And I'm always really interested to go to places where you have that sense that there are places in flux, that things could change, that big moments are happening there. And they happen, of course, everywhere. I mean, living in Britain, I think we've gone through a few big moments over the last few years ourselves. So you don't always have to leave home to find history. I think history is constantly happening everywhere, but certainly it adds an extra frisson to some of these places when you have that sense of going through tumultuous times.
When you're around history that much, especially much older history going back years and years and years and years, I remember being stationed in Iraq for a while, and we were just near Samarra. And it's amazing how you'll see something and you'll take it in for a second, like, wow, this is super old and everything like that. But you can also get pretty used to it almost a bit too fast, right? Like something just as immense as an old temple or anything like that, or an old mosque. Did you find that in Jerusalem? Like, sometimes you take it for granted that you're walking past something that is so immense and so meaningful to a lot of different people?
Yeah, well, when you're in a place like that where you're surrounded by so much historical evidence, and so many, you're walking past the Solomon's Temple, and you've got the Dome of the Rock, and then there's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and all these different places where moments in, if not historical moments in belief are believed to have happened. Yeah, I think it can be numbing, but every so often I find myself being reminded, and sort of almost like you play around with your eyesight and sort of just sort of remind yourself to open your eyes again, and you'd be thinking, wow, I'm standing at the place where, Mary is supposed to have been born, or where she ascended to heaven, or the Garden of Gethsemane, and I'd sort of suddenly be jolted in, and then I'd be thinking, oh God, I've got to go and mark the homework because I was working at a school there. So then you'd be thinking about practicalities, or I need to get myself something to eat for supper, or oh my God, I don't want to miss the my favorite kebab shop. So, but that is history, isn't it? Combining it with the everyday and the mundane.
Now, is Jerusalem your favorite place? I mean, you've been a lot of places. Is that because it seems like it started there for you?
I think it's a place I have a lot of fondness for. But to be honest, I think that I burnt myself out with Jerusalem a little bit. And, I haven't been back for a few years now, and I don't know how long it will take before I would feel like going back. But there are many places I've really loved. I mean, my favorite country to travel in was probably Iran, because the people there are just incredible, so hospitable. And because there's such a difference between the sort of media global image that we have of Iran as this very sort of dour and oppressive place, and there's a truth to all of that, and the reality of these incredibly sort of warm and welcoming, spirited people who live under a lot of that oppression, but manage to find ways to live creatively and wonderfully in spite of all the difficulties that they go through. And it's another country with such a rich history. It's amazing when you go to a place like Persepolis and you're standing here in the ruins that were damaged long ago by Alexander the Great, and often people will people still live through the history. So you start having a debate with somebody about whether Alexander was a good or a bad thing, and you're talking about Xerxes and all the various and Shah Shahpur and all the very the many Shahs in history, and there's so much history throughout that country. I love visiting some of the places connected with the medieval poets like Hafez or Ferdowsi. Ferdowsi in particular was a big inspiration for me. He wrote this fantastic epic called the Book of Kings, which travelled through thousands of years of Iranian history. So meeting people who connect with those stories, and it's amazing how many people do. I think once you start asking around for them, that for me is part of how history comes alive. Actually, seeing those buildings and monuments, but also meeting people for whom the history has meaning. That I think is where it really kind of starts to bubble up and really kind of gets me really excited.
And I mean, now you're a traveler, so I'm a homebody. I don't even know how to think about this, but have you thought about here's where I'm going to retire when it's all done? Like, I've already got everything picked out. Like, I'm ready to go. For you, is it like you can't even think about being in one spot for, any length of time?
Well, I do have this terrible itch, where I kind of, if I'm stayed put for a few months, and this was made obviously the pandemic absolutely terrible, if I'm sort of staying put for too long, then I start to get a little bit irritable, and I think, everybody else wants me to go traveling, if not myself, just get out of the house. So, I think it's something that, travelers have that, the travel bug, and I find myself looking at maps. I mean, to be honest, I do spend most of my time I'm at home, the journeys themselves are a fairly small part of my overall life, but I'm constantly looking at maps and sort of running my finger over the maps and thinking, well, wouldn't that be an amazing place to go? And I'd really love to travel there, and wonder if you could do a journey from there to there. So that takes up an enormous amount of my imaginative time, actually, just sort of imagining all kinds of journeys for the future.
Well, that makes me ask, where's the next stop, or where's some place that you haven't been yet that you're like, I have to get there?
Thing is, there's so many. I mean, I feel like I've been hardly anywhere yet. I've always wanted to go to Mongolia. I'd love to go and spend time in Mongolia, and a lot of those places actually sort of going Tibet and sort of along the sort of the plateau regions of Asia. I'd love to visit the Americas more. I'd love to see more Central America, Mexico, and some of those countries. I've recently been reading a fascinating novel from Haiti, and I'd love to travel there. So, there's everywhere really. I want to go to Papua New Guinea. I want to go to Indonesia. There's so many places. I don't really get into that idea of sort of bucket list, of just going to places to tick them off. If I'm going to visit somewhere, I really want to get into it and have a journey and an experience there. So, otherwise I don't really think there's much point in going.
Well, speaking of a journey, the Fairy Tellers takes you on a journey. I would love to hear, how did you get the idea of going back and writing about where fairy tales came from, how they became what they became, and how we know them today? How did you get that idea?
Well, I've been really fascinated for a long while in the connections between places and journeys and stories. So before this, I wrote a book about Europe's epic stories, and before that, there was a book about the epic stories of the Middle East. So I've been really sort of following these sort of connections between traveling and storytelling for a while. And so then I landed on fairy tales, and I've been fascinated by fairy tales all my life. My earliest reading memories are reading the Snow Queen, and sort of imagining that my whole bed was turning into Lapland, the icy sheets of Lapland. And later on as a student, sort of putting on plays about fairy tale characters. So they've sort of stuck with me, and having children of my own, reading fairy tales to them and reimagining fairy tales with them, that sort of was a big spark. And the whole sort of storytelling process, actually, of sort of telling stories to children had really made me think about, well, who are the people who told these stories originally, or how did these stories develop, and where did they come from? And I realized that I knew these stories, many of these stories, and loved them, but I didn't necessarily know who the people behind them were. And I wasn't even sure at the beginning if I would be able to find the people behind them, because some of them seem so universal, we don't think of them as being sort of written or told by anybody. But as I looked into it, I was fascinated to find that there were stories there. With most of the fairy tales, you can't necessarily say this story is written by this person, but it's more that they did something very significant to shape it, to make it into the story that has been passed on ever since. So whether it's the Neapolitan storyteller Giambattista Basile, who collected so many different stories and put them together in Europe's first fairy tale collection, the Tale of Tales, and that included the story of Cenerentola, which would become Cinderella, and Sleeping Beauty and Rapunzel, and many others, or whether it's the woman who wrote Beauty and the Beast, Gabrielle Susan de Villeneuve, who channeled her own life, aspects of her own life. She lived with a very curmudgeonly man who was compared by Casanova to a lion, and so she channeled aspects of that into that story. So she was taking a universal story, but she gave it so much her own imprint that then became the model of that, the template of that story that's been followed ever since. So it's about sort of finding those stories, and I found there was so much richness in them and in the lives of these people, and I wanted to celebrate them and to sort of pay tribute to them. I think a lot of them have been sort of forgotten by history, and I wanted to shine the light on them for a bit.
I have to point out, probably one of my favorite parts of the book is right in the beginning, where you just kind of talking about, as you were just saying, loved fairy tales for a long time. And you just have this one line where you talk about how, yes, I realized this probably wouldn't have gotten me dates back when I was a teenager being into fairy tales and things like that. But I think it's so important to the book because you set this tone of, there's a little bit of silliness to it, right? Some of these fairy tales, especially, and I want to ask about these, when you go back to the original, they're all over the place. But I do have to say, did you not know about Comic-Cons back then? Because I don't know how big they were, but I think you would have been a huge hit walking in there being able to be basically an encyclopedia of fairy tales.
No, I didn't know about Comic-Con then, I guess, when I was a student. I think as a student, a teenager, that's probably the one time when it is maybe a bit uncool to be into fairy tales. But that's why when I wrote about fairy tales then, I added in Elvis as a sort of side character, which was probably my way of trying to make it a bit more cool. But since then, I realized I didn't need him, actually. And it's all about going back to the fairy tale characters themselves.
Well, and you talk about in the book where, as you just said, they aren't necessarily written by any one person, but they get pulled together. So first things first, you have to say this. We're going to have to burst everybody's bubble. Disney did not write all of the fairy tales. Is that correct?
Disney didn't write any of them, and Disney certainly hasn't written the best versions of any of them. So I think that whilst I have a soft spot for some of the Disney films, and I think that they have done wonders with some of them, I think that the more you delve into sort of folk telling and old stories and the sort of the original transcripts, it's really difficult to feel sympathy with some of the creative decisions that Disney has made over the years. But that said, that's part of the reason why they're so well known today, isn't it?
Now, so each chapter focuses on a different fairy teller. How did you come up with this list? Did it start with like 50 and you had to whittle it down, or were there some that just jumped out and said, these are the ones I have to focus on?
God, yeah, I had so many sleepless nights over the choices I was making. I changed my mind about many of them. I think the original proposal for the book includes at least a couple that were very different from the ones that made it in the end. In the end, it was about the stories behind them. I mean, I wanted to have a sort of diverse and representative of fairy tale history as I could, and to cover many different periods and many different places. And so I've got storytellers from France, Germany, but also from the Middle East, from India. So hopefully to try and show as international a picture of the fairy tale as possible. It was about really, once I went into their history and then finding out, is there enough of a story there to tell? I mean, one of the storytellers that I didn't find originally and then found later was a Russian storyteller called Ivan Khudjakov. And once I learned about his story and found that he had left a memoir behind it, I mean, another thing was it was about the sources. Are there sources that I can use? And can I give my own original take on this story, or has it already been told recently? So there are all these sort of issues. But with him, I found that he had barely been covered at all in English. I mean, I think one of his stories had been translated in an anthology. And apart from that, he'd really just been ignored in English and sort of, Western history. And yet he had this fascinating life. He collected fairy tales. He produced a collection of fairy tales at the age of just 18. Wonderful macabre characters like Baba Yaga, the witch in a hut on chicken legs, and many others. And then he got involved in a plot to assassinate the Tsar. So it was an amazingly sort of chaotic life, and he ended up being sent to Siberia and going completely crazy. So in a way, a very sort of classic 19th century Russian life that tells us a lot about that about that country at any time, but certainly at that time. So once I read his story, I thought, well, he's got to be in it, and I've got to tell his story because it hasn't been told. And it was the same with a lot of them. I mean, when it came to the woman who wrote Beauty and the Beast, Gabrielle Susan de Villeneuve, I was really surprised when I went into the scholarship to find how little attention she'd been given. And I thought, well, then her story's got to be told. The story she told, Beauty and the Beast, is very famous, but her own story, her own biography, is very little known. There's quite a bit in French about it, actually, but most of it hadn't been translated into English. And that, I think, is one of the keys, that because it hadn't been translated, she was still sort of off our radar. So one of the things that has been sort of perpetuated by a lot of English language scholars about Gabrielle Susan de Villeneuve is the idea that her version of Beauty and the Beast wasn't very popular, and it wasn't until it was retold by a later storyteller that it really sort of gained popularity. The reason that version was written was because there was already a popular version of the story that was available. The Syrian storyteller Hannah Diab, his memoir, he left a memoir, and he's the guy who told stories like Aladdin and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, really the classic stories from the 1001 Nights. And we didn't know very much about him. Nobody knew very much about him until very recently, when a memoir was found in the Vatican and translated only recently into French just a few years ago, and more recently into English. And so now that's available, but that's something that's only recently become available. So it's that excitement of realizing there are all these people who've had a huge impact on fairy tale history, and yet their stories haven't been told, and a lot of the actual sources available to tell their stories have only become available in very recent years. So that's something very new. So even though these stories are very old and they come from a long time ago, the possibility to tell their stories is something that really has only come about in the last few years.
So what I'm hearing, though, is that we need to keep an eye out for The Fairy Tellers Part 2, because it seems like there's a lot more to go with this.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many storytellers, so many that I didn't include. I mean, there's a wonderful storyteller called the Baroness Dornoy, who I touch on in the book, because she was a fantastic storyteller and had a fantastic life. She got exiled. She sort of framed her husband, got exiled to England, hung out with the Earl of Rochester and all kinds of rakes in Restoration England, and was apparently a spy. And I didn't include her mainly because my idea was I wanted to have just one storyteller from a country, to try and keep it moving around, going to different places. And I already had the woman who wrote Beauty and the Beast there. So yeah, she's the kind of person who I would include. Or there's Lafcadio O'Hearn, who's a fascinating sort of American scholar adventurer who he was a journalist as well. He traveled to Japan and collected stories in Japan. And I thought, and his life actually was really interesting. And there are so many people that, you could delve into and find out more about them.
And I don't want to be too spoilery, but it's very interesting when you're reading through and you're seeing that so much of these fairy tales have that biographical information. And the way you write it, too, you write it as if like, oh, man, I just found out that this is why this looks like this in Beauty and the Beast, and this is why this, and this was part of this person's life. Were you constantly finding those things where, oh, this is why the fairy tale says what it says, is because it's part biographical of the fairy teller?
Yeah, well, one of the people I interviewed is Kate Forsyth, who's written many books about fairy tales, and she made the point that there's a reason that people tell certain stories, people connect to certain stories. And I guess that's something that I found throughout the research process, is that many people will tell these stories, but often a particular storyteller tells that story and it connects so much for them in some way with their life or with what they feel about their life, that they are then able to give it a very powerful sort of shape. So you find that with Dorchen Wilde, I think, sort of telling stories like Hansel and Gretel. I think she was drawing on her own fear of family abandonment. And I think that the stories like The Six Swans, which draws on her own sense of being kind of voiceless, but, you know, always working hard, always trying her best and sort of having to keep quiet whilst sort of horrible things are going on around her. So I think that it was through that power of connection that possibly that she was able to give those stories a particular impress that was then taken on by the Brothers Grimm. I mean, I think it's always a sort of juggling act and a judgment issue of not wanting to sort of overstate the biography and to always be aware that there's this imaginative process going on as well. And there's all these other storytellers retelling the stories. So it's a very fluid thing. It's not static. It's not like this story could only ever have been told by this person in this particular time. But more that I just think that people come to stories in particular moments, and often there's reasons for that, and that then that sort of, you know, that rubs off in some way.
We should talk about the fact that when you go back to some of these sources, a lot of these fairy tales are, I believe the kids call it nightmare fuel. Like, there is some messed up stuff in these original stories that, of course, if you watch Disney's The Little Mermaid, you're like, this is a very nice story. And then you go back to the fairy tale and you go, oh, I can't tell my kid that story. You must have ran into that a lot. You drop a few nuggets along the way in the book, and you're like, that's what happened? Oh, dear Lord, I can't tell my kid that.
It's sort of understandable sometimes when you see how dark the stories are, and you sort of realize why they might have been diluted a bit. Quite shocking when you read, for example, the first version of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and you find out that the queen isn't Snow White's stepmother. She's her mother, and she's jealous of her being beautiful, and she wants the huntsman to kill her so that she can eat her heart and her organs and therefore absorb her beauty. So yeah, nice family relations there.
Yeah, I feel like that one needed to be updated just a wee bit. Also, I just have to state a fair amount of just murder, incest, stuff all over the place. It gets crazy.
They are all over the place. Yeah, I mean the Grimms, obviously. Yeah, there's loads. Like one of the stories that Dorchen Wilde told, which is about the girl who has to escape from the palace because her father wants to marry her. And the weird thing is that the original version of the story that Dorchen Wilde told to the Grimms doesn't make it clear about whether she's actually escaped and married another prince or whether she has actually come back to her father. So it's a very odd tale. And there are loads of them. They're very dark and grisly. And the further back you go in time, then the darker and stranger they seem to become. And I find that fascinating. It tells so much about the world long ago, and it was a crazy place, and there was a lot of strange storytelling going on, and you realize children were being told very, very odd tales, so you can understand maybe why some of them grew up to be a little bit strange.
Little bit. The Grimms is a fantastic story because they just kind of got their own crew together and started telling each other stories. And then it's like, oh, we're going to start writing them down. And then when you say fairy tales, Grimm is one of the names that people know. And it was just them hanging out with their friends, writing down stories that they heard.
It's sort of lovely, isn't it? That idea of this little sort of parlor that they would sit there. They'd be telling each other stories. They'd have the Wild girls from across the road. They'd have the Hassenflugs from around the corner. They'd have all these sort of friends and neighbors who would come in and sort of pitch in their stories. I mean, it's sort of one of those things, like if you could travel back in time, I would so love to be able to go to the Grimm's house and castle and their apartment. Actually, I mean, it's a very pokey small place, I think, and be able to sort of sit there in a corner and eavesdrop. It does sound absolutely fascinating, and it's amazing how this idea of the salon, the sort of the storytelling place, I mean, it goes back to that idea of the power of oral storytelling. You find it in a lot of these different periods of fairy tale history. I mean, that's what stories are for, really. They're wonderful when they're written down and we can read them, in the privacy of our own homes. But they're also so wonderful when you can share stories in a combined sort of communal setting. I've been to a few storytelling experiences where it is something I think is really wonderful, that sense of being together in a room listening to stories.
And you can there's no such thing as copyright back when you're talking about these stories were told, but it's also something that you touch on. Which is, if you're writing it down, do you kind of own it? Is it yours? Or how do you tell people that this is not what I put together, but I heard it from here and things like that? And we've lost much of that. But it is something that people bring up, right? Grimm, people think that they wrote them, quote unquote, but really they were just, like many of the fairy tellers, just capturing things that they've heard from other people. Is that something that people still talk about today? Like, Grimm didn't write it. It's like, yeah, we get it. They were really collecting. But do you lose a little bit when these collectors kind of take on a life of their own?
Well, the Grimms were very honest at the time about their process. They said we have collected these stories. At the same time, they didn't name the storytellers. And I think that now, if you were doing it, you would. But we have to give them a lot of credit, as they were the sort of pioneers of so much about folkloric research. And so I think, they did so much good really for culture. Fortunately, they did note down who had told them their stories, sometimes quite cryptically, but they did sort of give some information in their what was called the Hand Exemplar, which was a sort of draft version or a sort of early proof of their children's and household tales. And so we're able to track back sort of who told those stories. I don't know if anything's really lost, because I think in the end, what really matters is the stories. And as long as the stories get through, in a way, it doesn't matter too much if we don't know who told the stories. I mean, of course, with this book, I'm trying to celebrate these people who did tell the stories. But the reason that I'm celebrating them is because we've got the stories. And that's the most important thing, that those stories keep going, that they're passed through and that we're able to keep enjoying them.
What is your favorite fairy tale? It can either be the original messed up one or a nicer, more updated one. Do you have one that sticks out to you?
Well, my probably sort of all-time favorite, I think, is The Snow Queen, which, because it's Hans Christian Andersen, he wrote down his stories and published them. So there isn't a sort of process between the original teller and the publication. He invented that story himself. But at the same time, he was drawing on an archetypal story, which goes back to tales like Cupid and Psyche from ancient times, various sort of stories that he was drawing on. But it's very much his own original tale. And I think it's a wonderful tale. He draws on his own experience of growing up in poverty in Odense in Denmark, and also of his father telling him about a sort of snow maiden that then crystallized in his imagination into this idea of the Snow Queen. And he was drawing on his experiences of women. He had a lot of difficult experiences with women, which is all about Andersen and nothing really about the women. So he sort of developed, I think, in his mind, this idea of the ice-hearted woman who rejects his glowing heart. In a way, it's a very beautiful, simple story about a girl going to rescue her friend. And I love that side of it. I love the idea of, the kid who just wants to get their friend back. I think as a child, I connected with that. I think any child, you go through those moments where you lose a friend, or where your friend suddenly goes cold, and, you're young and don't understand what's going on. And I think that story really speaks to that. But also just the adventure of it, traveling across the forest, through the tundra, over the icy, snowy plains, and then reaching this magical palace of snow. And I found that all really, really sort of thrilling. I love how so many fairy tales have that sort of some kind of really sort of glamorous image in them, whether it's a snow palace or a hut made out of gingerbread, or some other element in it that makes the story really sort of visible. And so that story, has always really stuck with me.
I forget, was there a talking snowman in that version or no?
Not in the original, no.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah.
That is, especially that you just said that, and it clicked for me. With fairy tales, the setting is one of the most important pieces. Snow White, you conjure those dark woods and things like that. Ice Queen, it's all of that. The setting is its own character, because you got to get it right, otherwise it makes it less memorable in my thinking.
Absolutely. And that's why fairy tales are actually really closely connected with place. And so that's why I think, for writing this book, I felt like it was really important to go to some of these places and to try and experience the tales, or to sort of be in the places that might have inspired them or spawned them in some way. You mentioned the dark forest. So one of the experiences that I had was traveling to the Black Forest in Germany and camping out there. They have these wonderful sort of campers huts where you can just stay. So, just sort of putting my sleeping bag out in the hut and it was a little bit cold, but it was just lovely being out in the Black Forest and feeling like, anything might happen. Some magical occurrence might happen. A bit disappointing in the morning to realize that it hadn't, and it was just freezing cold. But then the next day there was a witch festival in the local village in Woudkirch, and these men who dressed up as witches, they were part of the witch guild, and they were sort of celebrating. It's been something that they've been celebrating for decades there, and so that brought an element of magic to that experience.
I was going to say, is there a least favorite fairy tale for you? But obviously you look at them and you understand them for like what they are. And so I guess I should ask, is there a fairy tale that is the weirdest to you, that you just don't quite get it? No matter how you look at it, you just can't quite figure out how we still have it here because it doesn't quite make sense to you?
If I was to pick one as the weirdest, I would probably go with The Old Woman Who Was Skinned. But I actually really like it. And it's, as the name of the tale suggests, it's it's about an old woman who gets skinned. So there's two of them. There are two old women who want to be young and beautiful. Her sister gets turned into a beautiful young girl by some fairies, and she doesn't. And so she ends up going for a more grisly fate. It's definitely, very weird. A lot of the story is about these two sisters sucking their fingers to try and stick their fingers through a hole so that the king nearby thinks that they're young. So it's a story that I wouldn't really retell to children.
Yeah, we might have to put an advisory on this episode.
I sort of understand why Disney hasn't done that one. Another one that I tell in a few of the talks that I've been doing about this book is called The Cockroach, the Mouse and the Cricket, and it all comes down to a lot of these weird ones come from Basile's Tale of Tales. He's just brilliant for weird tales. It's about there's a sort of he's a kind of local rustic guy who's got this magical cockroach, mouse and cricket. He takes them along to this princess who's never laughed, and they make her laugh, and the king has said anybody who can make her laugh will get to marry her. But then when he realizes that this guy is sort of poor and just a sort of yokel, he has him thrown in the lion's pit and marries his daughter to a German lord instead, who throughout the Tale of Tales we're constantly being told about sort of either Germans and Spaniards are always getting short shrift, and so the German lord eats too much and is seen as a bit overweight, and on the wedding night the hero sends his cockroach, mouse and cricket to sort of to stop the wedding from being consummated, and so the cockroach goes up between the lord's legs and basically acts as a suppository that ends up with causing an awful lot of mess in the marriage bed. And this goes on for 3 nights. The second night the mouse comes along and gnaws through the lord's underwear, and then the cockroach does his business. The third night the cricket keeps him awake by playing music to him, and then the mouse gnaws through he's now got himself wearing basically a nappy, and then the cockroach comes along. So it's a very messy wedding bed. The poor princess says, I don't want to be married to this guy anymore, and so she ends up marrying a guy who's pulled out of the lion pit with his magical cockroach, mouse and cricket. So yeah, that's a pretty weird one, I guess.
I'm just reminded that they probably had a lot of opium available in this time and place, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, that one's 17th century, so I don't think they've really got that excuse.
So, Nick, one of the reasons we founded History Nerd Net is because a lot of people think history is boring, right? And I think we've done a pretty good job of pointing out that it can be, at the very least, weird, if not entertaining. But if one of those people said, I don't read history is boring, what would you say to them to make them read the fairy tellers so that they really get to understand how much fun this stuff can be?
Firstly, I would find it very hard to understand why anybody would find history boring. But if they do, then I think one of the things about the fairy tales is it's about stories behind stories. So you may not be interested in history, but you could be interested in storytelling or just in fiction. These are stories that are sort of retold as fiction. And a lot of these stories are constantly being retold. I mean, Beauty and the Beast is one of those stories that people are coming up with new spins on Beauty and the Beast all the time. So I guess it's a sort of bridge between fiction and history. So I would hope that if you're interested in books at all or in stories, then you can still feel that there's a way into that book. History itself, is at its best is just stories, really. It's stories of people's lives, which is what novels are about, and what so much of literature is about. History is about time traveling, I think, about trying to sort of go back in time and see what it was like to live then.
Well, Nick, I may have a couple of new nightmares tonight, but this was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks very much for having me.
And that's it for this episode. Thank you, Nick, for coming on. Fantastic conversation. Nerds, please go on out there, follow us on social media, go to the website, leave us comments, leave us ratings, let us know how we're doing out there. Appreciate you listening. Talk to you soon, nerds.